Amara once had a name that carried warmth. Spoken by her mother, it sounded like a lullaby. Spoken by her father, it sounded like protection. Now on this journey across the endless sea, her name is a sound she dares not whisper. To the men who drag her from port to port, she is not Amara, she is cargo. She is the foreign bride, the black one, the rare body that will fetch a price. The ship creaked like an animal in pain as it cut through dark waters. Salt air burned. Her cracked lips and her wrists bore the raw marks of chains rubbed deep into flesh. Around her, other women huddled in silence, their eyes hollow, their dresses torn and stiff with sweat. Some wept quietly into their palms. Others stared into nothing, already emptied of tears. The traders barked orders in a language Amara barely understood, their voices coarse with greed. Night on the ship was the cruelest. The boards groaned under restless feet, the air thick with fear and the sour stench of bodies crammed into too little space. Sometimes the men came down to inspect them. Amara learned quickly not to meet their eyes, for eyes could be read as defiance. She had once cried out when a girl beside her was struck. The memory of the lash across her own shoulders was enough to silence her forever. The sea journey was not counted in days or weeks, but in heartbeats of dread. Amara clung to fragments of memory like driftwood in a storm, her mother's hands kneading cassava, her little brother chasing fireflies in the dusk, her father's voice telling her, "Strength is not in the chains you bear, but in the breath you keep." Those words became prayer, though prayer felt brittle in a place where the sky itself seemed to abandon them. When the ship finally docked, dawn broke pale over a harbor crowded with cries and commerce. Amara stumbled onto land, her legs weak from confinement. The city rose before her, roofs of curved tile, banners fluttering. Men in silk robes haggling over prices of rice silk and bodies. To Amara, the city looked like a painting smeared with cruelty. The buyers waited. She was marched, along with the other women, through a narrow street that stank of fish and incense. People stared. Children pointed and laughed, mocking the strangeness of her dark skin. One merchant stroked his beard and muttered, "Exotic, rare, worth more than the rest." His eyes burned into her like she was less than human, a jewel to be priced, a beast to be displayed. It was then that Amara first saw Master Wei. He was a man of middle years, dressed in layers of silk embroidered with gold threads, his hair tied neatly beneath an ornate cap. His expression was calm, like a predator at rest. He examined the line of women with the same detachment one might show cattle. When his eyes reached Amara, they lingered, not with kindness, not with cruelty, but with ownership. He raised his hand, spoke a few clipped words to the trader. The deal was done. The chain around her wrists was pulled, forcing her to stumble toward him. Wei regarded her closely as if inspecting a purchase. His fingers, smooth and adorned, with rings gripped her chin, tilting her face upward. She wanted to turn away, to spit, to vanish. But the memory of lashes held her still. "You will come," he said in slow, accented words, testing her comprehension. Then, with a faint smile, he added, "Grateful." That night, Amara entered his household, not as wife, not as woman, but as possession. The compound was vast, its stone walls blotting out the world beyond. Lanterns glowed along courtyards paved in clean stone, a cruel contrast to the filth and misery of the slave quarters tucked at the far edge. Servants moved quickly, bowing their heads when Master Wei passed.
Ow.
Overseers prowled the shadows with whips coiled at their sides, their presence constant as iron. Amara was dragged to a chamber where attendants scrubbed her with rough hands until her skin burned. They dressed her in a plain robe, pale and stiff, and led her to a small cell-like room. It had no window, only a mat on the floor and a bucket in the corner. The air smelled of damp stone. When the heavy door closed, the silence pressed down. On her like a second chain, she sat there, trembling. Her hands pressed to her chest as though trying to hold her heart in place. She whispered her name, Amara, over and over, as if saying it aloud might protect it from erasure. But the walls did not answer. The first night, she heard footsteps outside. The overseer's voice barking orders, the muffled cries of other women. She curled herself small, praying not to be noticed. Sleep never came, only a thin doze broken by the echo of her homeland and dreams' laughter. Music, her mother's lullaby until morning, dragged her back into this new life. When dawn came, she learned what it meant to be bride in Master Way's house. Asterisk, when the first light seeped into her cell. The heavy door scraped open. A guard barked in a harsh tongue, gesturing with his whip. Amara rose unsteadily, her limbs stiff, and followed. They led her into the courtyard where other women already knelt in rows. Their heads bowed low to the earth. Master Way entered soon. After walking with the deliberate calm of a man who knew every eye was his to command. Behind him trailed attendants carrying trays of food, fabrics, and ledgers. He circled the kneeling women, pausing now and then to issue quiet remarks. When he stopped before Amara, silence deepened. Way's eyes swept over her, the way a collector might study a rare artifact. His voice was smooth, almost polite, but laced with cruelty. Stand. Her body obeyed before her mind had chosen. She rose, trembling, her robe hanging loosely over her frame. Way reached forward, brushing a strand of her hair back from her face. His touch was light, but it burned like fire. This one, he said to his overseer, is foreign. She must learn quickly. If she resists, she will be broken. The overseer grinned, tapping the whip coiled in his hand. Amara's throat tightened, but she kept her gaze lowered, remembering the pain of defiance. Way turned back to the line of women. You are here as brides. Do not forget that word. Bride obeys. A bride serves. A bride is grateful. His tone was calm, almost soothing, yet each syllable carried the weight of iron shackles. You belong to me, and through me you will find purpose. The other women bowed deeper, murmuring obedience. Amara hesitated, the word bride slicing through her with bitter irony. She had once imagined herself as a bride, dressed in white, standing in sunlight, her family smiling as vows were exchanged. Now the word had been twisted, hollowed, and weaponized. Way's gaze flickered back to her. He smiled faintly as though sensing her inner resistance. Without a word, he nodded to the overseer. The whip cracked across her back before she had time to breathe. Fire tore through her skin, forcing a cry from her throat. The other women flinched but did not look up. They knew better. Grateful Way repeated softly, almost tenderly, "You will learn." Her days began to follow a pattern carved from cruelty. Before dawn, she was dragged from her cell to labor. The compound stretched vast and unyielding courtyards to be scrubbed, water jars to be carried, grain to be ground. Overseers stalked the grounds like wolves, lashing out at the faintest pause. The sun rose high, burning her skin, but water was rationed cruelly. Amara learned quickly that her presence drew attention. Her dark skin, unfamiliar to most, marked her as different. Servants whispered, guests stared, overseers mocked.
Oh.
Some called her the Black Jewel, others Beast Bride. Every word was designed to carve deeper wounds into her dignity. At meals, she was not allowed to eat until Way's household had finished. Leftovers, cold rice, scraps of vegetables were thrown at her like feed for an animal. Yet hunger drove her to crouch in corners and swallow every grain. When night fell, she was returned to her cell. Alone, she pressed her hands to the fresh wounds on her back, her fingers trembling. Sometimes she whispered to the walls, her mother's name, her brother's name, the sound of her homeland's rivers. She feared forgetting them, feared that silence would erase the only fragments of freedom she still carried. One evening, after a particularly long day of toil, she was summoned to Way's chamber. 2 guards led her through a corridor hung with red silk lanterns, their glow casting shadows that seemed to mock her trembling form. The chamber was richly decorated, carved wooden screens, painted scrolls, vases overflowing with lotus flowers. Way sat calmly at a low table, sipping tea. When she entered, he looked up with a faint smile. Sit. Her body resisted. But the guards forced her down onto the mat opposite him. Way studied her as one might study a new possession. You must understand, he said gently, that resistance is suffering, obedience is peace. If you learn this, your life here will not be unbearable." His tone was soft, but his eyes were sharp, a blade wrapped in silk. He reached across the table. Placing his hand lightly over hers, she flinched. His smile widened. "You see, still untamed? Wait. But you will bend." They all bend. When she did not answer, he withdrew his hand and sipped his tea. "You are fortunate. Do you know why?" She shook her head. "Because I chose you. Others would treat you with less care." His eyes narrowed. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness." Then, with a flick of his fingers, he dismissed her. As the guards dragged her back to her cell, Amara's mind churned with conflicting tides. Rage, sorrow, fear. Words echoed. They all bend. In the silence of her room, she pressed her palms to her face and whispered her name again. "Amara? Amara?" She feared the day might come when she no longer remembered it. The chapter closes with Amara lying on her mat, staring into the dark. Beyond the walls, the compound hummed with life servants, soldiers, overseers, all part of a machine designed to crush her spirit. She clutched her memories tight. The scent of her mother's cooking, the sound of her brother's laughter, the feel of her father's rough hands steadying her. Shoulder's tears slipped silently down her cheeks. For the first time since her capture, allowed herself a single thought. Dangerous and fragile, one day they will not own me. One day I will be more than chains, and then sleep claimed her, carrying her back to a homeland she might never see again. Asterisk. Morning did not come with light. It came with the crack of whips against doors, the bark of overseers' voices, and the rattling of chains being dragged into motion. Amara woke to the sound of keys grinding in locks, her body stiff from the cold mat. Her back still burned with the memory of lashes, skin tender beneath the thin robe. The heavy door swung open. Guards shouted, motioning for her to rise. She obeyed. Not from willingness, but from knowledge. Hesitation meant pain. The air outside was sharp and damp, smelling of stone and sweat. A gray mist clung to the compound, shrouding its walls, but no fog could soften the cruelty carved into this place. The slaves were herded into the courtyard like cattle, their bare feet scraping against cold stone. The overseer, a thick-set man named Bao, stood at the front. His voice thundered like iron striking metal. "Work begins now. Failure is punished. Defiance is death." No one answered. They bowed their heads, already broken by routine. Amara felt the weight of silence pressing down on her, the silence of those who had cried too long, who had learned that words had no power here. Her first task was to carry water. Jars nearly as tall as her knees lined the courtyard, waiting to be filled at the well. The jars were heavy, their clay rough against her palms, and the path stretched long over uneven stones. Each trip left her shoulders screaming, but Beau's watchful eyes allowed no pause. Amara stumbled once, her foot catching against a loose stone. The jar tilted, spilling water onto the ground. The whip sang before she could steady it. Fire lanced. Across her back, her knees buckling. Beau's voice roared. "Careless, you waste what feeds the household. You think water is yours to spill?" Amara bit her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself not to cry out. She knew tears would only fuel his delight. The other slaves watched from the corners of their eyes. None dared help her. In this place, mercy was forbidden. To reach out a hand meant sharing the lash dot with trembling arms. She righted the jar, scooped more water, and forced her body to move again. Step after agonizing step, she carried the weight. By midday, her robe clung to her body with sweat. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but no food came. Instead, she was sent to grind grain. Crouching over a stone mill, pushing its heavy wheel in endless circles, the task burned her muscles raw, her breath shallow, her hands blistering. It was here she first noticed Milan, a slender girl with downcast eyes and hair bound in a tight braid. Milan moved silently at the next millstone, was quick, precise, her movements practiced from years in the compound. When their eyes met briefly, Amara saw something flicker. Not pity, but recognition. A silent acknowledgement of shared suffering. That small glance was more comfort than any words could have been. Later, as Bo turned his attention elsewhere, Milan dared to whisper, "Don't fight the stone. Let it turn with you. Save your strength." The voice was so soft, Amara wondered if she had imagined it. But when she adjusted her rhythm, the strain eased slightly. She glanced at Milan again, and this time the girl gave the faintest nod. The noon bell brought not food but new labor. Amara was ordered to scrub the outer courtyard, a vast space stained with the dirt of countless feet. Buckets of cold water were dumped across the stones, and she was handed a brush with bristles as coarse as thorns. Kneeling, she worked until her knees ached, her hands raw. The overseer circled like a vulture, snapping the whip whenever someone slowed, as she bent. To her task, guests entered the compound, wealthy men in silk, their laughter carrying across the courtyard. They paused when they saw her, their voices shifting. "Look at that one," one said in the local tongue, loud enough for her to hear, "skin like midnight. Where did Wei find such a creature?" Another laughed, "Exotic. He collects rarities like a merchant collects spices." Their laughter burned hotter than the whip. Amara kept her eyes on the stones, scrubbing until her fingers bled, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Evening brought meager food, a bowl of thin rice gruel, barely enough to dull the hunger gnawing at her belly. Amara crouched in the corner of the slave quarters, spooning each mouthful slowly. Stretching the taste as long as she could, Malin sat nearby, eating in silence. After a long pause, she whispered again, "You'll learn when to bow, when to keep your head down. It keeps you alive." Amara swallowed hard. "Live," she echoed, the word tasting bitter. Milan's eyes flickered toward the guards before meeting hers again. "Live is better than gone." Amara thought of her family, of her brother's laughter, her mother's voice, her father's strength. Alive, yes, but what kind of life was this? That night, lying on her mat, her body broken from labor, Amara clutched her memories tight. She could feel them slipping like sand through her fingers. But she held on with all her might. The weight of mourning would always return, heavy and merciless. But she swore silently. It would not crush the last piece of her that was still Amara. Asterisk. The nights were no kinder than the days. After hours of labor, when the compound finally quieted, Amara lay awake, listening to the muffled sobs of other women. Some whispered prayers in tongues she did not know. Others clutched the hems of their robes, rocking themselves for comfort. The air was thick with despair, a silence broken only by the scurry of rats or the distant sound of Master Wei's laughter. Drifting from the banquet hall, one evening, when exhaustion threatened to drown her, she heard Milan's voice again, barely a breath. "Don't cry where they can hear you," pleases them. Amara swallowed hard, biting back tears she hadn't realized were falling. She turned her head slightly toward Milan's shadow.
"How long
have you been here?" Milan's silence stretched so long, Amara thought she would not answer. Then, 3 years. The words fell heavy as stones. 3 years of waking 2 whips, of labor without end, of nights without dreams. Amara's stomach turned at the thought not only of surviving it, but of becoming numb to it. "And before?" Amara asked. Milan's face was hidden in the dark. "Before doesn't matter here. Forgetting is safer." Amara wanted to argue, to cling to the fragments of her own past, the laughter of her brother, the voice of her father. But the weight of Milan's tone stilled her. Perhaps in this place, memory itself was rebellion. The next morning, Amara's endurance was tested again. Wei had guests, men of wealth and power, and the slaves were ordered to prepare the banquet hall. Amara scrubbed floors until her knees ached raw, her fingers split from the rough cloth. She carried trays heavy with steaming dishes, balancing them while weaving between tables. Every stumble drew sharp laughter from the guests, who delighted in her clumsy foray. At one point, a guest reached out and gripped her arm, turning it to marvel at her skin. "Like polished ebony," he murmured, loud enough for others to hear. "Does it feel different?" The hall erupted in laughter. It rose to Amara's face, shame burning deeper than any lash. She wanted to pull away, to strike him, to reclaim. The space that was hers? But Wei's eyes were upon her, calm, cold, expectant. She lowered her head, silent, until the guest released her. Later, when the feast ended, Wei summoned her. "You must understand," he said, pouring himself wine. "Your difference is valuable. You are a jewel none of them possess. They envy me. That envy is your purpose." His words were like poison seeping into her veins. He wanted her to believe she was not a woman but a trophy, a thing to be displayed, mocked, and owned. Amara clenched. Her fists at her sides, nails cutting her palms. She gave him no answer. Silence was her only shield. Wei's smile did not falter. "In time you will learn gratitude." Asterisk, the cycle deepened. Days blurred into weeks, each dawn bringing the same. Agony. Water to carry, grain to grind, floors to scrub. The overseers grew harsher with every passing hour, their whips striking not only for mistakes, but for amusement. Yet amid the cruelty, Amara found moments brief, fragile that reminded her she was still human. One afternoon, as she stumbled under the weight of 2 jars, her vision blurring with exhaustion, Malen appeared at her side. Without speaking, she steadied the jar with her own hands until they reached the well. It was a small act, quick and dangerous, but it lit a spark in Amara's chest. Another evening, when Bo hurled insults at her, calling her beast, "Shadow thing, Ronnie," a young Indian slave with eyes like deep wells, whispered a verse of poetry under her breath as they returned to their quarters. "Chains do not bind the soul, only the body. The soul can fly even when the feet bleed." Amara held those words close, repeating them silently as she lay on her mat. They were not freedom, but they were fire. One night Wei returned from a journey and summoned her to the courtyard. Lanterns flickered, casting long shadows. Guards surrounded them, their faces expressionless. Wei stood in the center, his hands clasped behind his back. "Show me your obedience," he commanded. Amara froze. Bo. Her knees locked. Something inside her rebelled, a stubborn flame that refused to kneel. But she saw the overseer's whip twitch, ready. Slowly, painfully, she lowered herself to the ground. Her forehead touched the cold stone. Wei's footsteps circled her. "Good. You learn, but you hesitated." The whip cracked across her back. Pain flared white, forcing a cry from her lips. Wei leaned close, his voice a whisper only she could hear. "Remember this. Obedience brings peace. Defiance brings pain. Which will you choose, Amara?" Hearing her name on his lips felt like violation, as though he had stolen even that. She bit her tongue, refusing to answer. Wei straightened, his voice once more calm. "Take her back. She will learn." That night, Amara lay on her mat, her body aflame with pain. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she let no sound escape. She remembered her father's words. "Strength is not in the chains you bear, but in the breath you keep." The weight of morning would return, heavy and merciless. But she swore silently. Her breath would remain hers. No whip, no overseer, no master could take that. And though the days stretched endless before her, she felt the faintest ember inside, small, fragile, but alive. Asterisk, pain has many voices. Some scream, some whisper, some speak in silence so heavy it drowns the soul. For Amara, pain became the only language allowed. The first time she was whipped until she lost consciousness. It was for something as small as a glance. She had dared to look toward the sky as she carried grain across the courtyard. Her eyes caught for a moment by a flight of birds arcing in perfect freedom. Bo's whip struck before she even realized he was watching. The leather tore across her back, once, twice, again, until she collapsed. Blood ran beneath her robe, warm against her skin. She could not move, could not beg. The other women kept their heads bowed, their bodies trembling, but none dared intervene. When she awoke in her cell hours later, her body was fire and stone, every breath, agony, every shift of her muscles a scream. She pressed her face into the mat and sobbed silently from that day. Amara learned that even the smallest freedoms, a glance, a sigh, a whisper of longing, came with a price. Pain was the only answer they gave. Master Wei's cruelty was not like Bo's. Bo's whip was blunt force, the roar of a storm. Wei's cruelty was quiet, deliberate, and far more terrifying. He rarely raised his hand, but his words cut deeper than any lash. He would summon Amara into his chamber, pour himself tea, and ask her questions in that calm, silken voice. Do you think yourself beautiful? Do you believe you are human? Tell me, Amara. Who would miss you if you vanished? She never answered. Silence was her shield, but Wei always smiled, as if her silence confirmed what he already believed, that she was nothing more than a hollow thing, a shell he owned. Sometimes he made her stand before guests, commanding her to hold her head high, while they laughed at her dark skin, comparing it to coal, to night, to shadow. She is mine, Wei would say with pride, as though unveiling a rare painting. A jewel none of you will ever own. The humiliation cut deep. Amara wanted to scream, to claw their eyes, to burn the entire hall to ash. But she stood still, trembling, her pride bleeding into the stone beneath her feet. Among the slaves, Cain was currency. They compared scars and whispers, not with pride, but with resignation. Each scar told a story. The woman who spilled rice, the man who stumbled in the fields, the girl who dared to sing too loudly. Amara's own back became a map of lines, fresh wounds laid over old scars. When she washed herself in cold water at night, she sometimes traced them with her fingers, each one a reminder of battles lost without ever being fought. Yet pain also became teacher. She learned to move silently, to bow before being told to, keep her eyes fixed on the ground. She learned that every breath must be measured, every word swallowed. It was not obedience, it was survival. Still, memory haunted her. At night, in the restless dark, she thought of her younger brother. His laughter had been a melody she once carried everywhere. She had promised him, on the last night before her capture, that she would always protect him. Now she wondered, had he been taken to? Had he searched for her? Did he think she abandoned him? The thought gnawed at her worse than hunger. Sometimes, when pain was too much, she imagined his small hands slipping into hers, guiding her out of the compound, through forests, across seas, back home. She clung to that vision like a prayer. One evening, Bo accused Amara of stealing food. She had not. She barely touched what little was given, but a scrap of bread had gone missing, and he needed someone to punish. Dragged before Wei, Amara kept her head bowed as Bo shouted, "She takes what is not hers. She lies. She steals." Wei studied her with calm eyes. Is this true? Amara shook her head, her lips pressed tight. Wei sighed, as if disappointed. If she is innocent, the pain will teach her not to invite suspicion. If she is guilty, the pain will teach her not to repeat it. Either way, pain is lessened. The whip fell until her vision blurred, until her screams tore through the night. The other women heard but did not intervene. Their silence was its own. Language, the silence of people who knew pain too well to share it. When they dragged her back to her cell, Milan crept to her side. She pressed a damp cloth against Amara's wounds, whispering, "Breathe." Just breathe, Amara did. By breath, she clung to life. Days bled into weeks. Amara's body carried scars, but her mind began to adapt. She saw how others survived, learned to read the overseer's moods, sensed when to shrink into shadow. Pain had become grammar, lashes the punctuation, silence the sentences. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars, a fragment of her still spoke another language, the language of dignity. She carried it quietly, hidden like an ember in ash, and though she bowed, though she bled, though she cried into the dark, Amara swore she would never let that ember die, because if she lost that, if she let them take even that, then she would no longer be Amara. She would be what they called her, nothing, and she refused to be nothing. Asterisk, what is a human life worth? When measured in silver? For Amara, the answer was revealed in a marketplace where flesh was cheaper than silk, where tears were part of the price. The journey began before dawn. Bows stormed through the compound, his whip cracking against the stones. "Up, all of you," he barked. Women stumbled from their cells, their eyes swollen from restless nights, their bodies sore from yesterday's labor. Amara followed silently, her steps heavy, but her face composed. She had learned not to reveal pain. Pain was private. Pain was survival. The caravan moved like cattle. A line of broken women marched through narrow alleys until they reached the open square. Amara had seen glimpses. Before strangers passing, merchants whispering, but nothing prepared her. For the full brutality of the bride market, the square pulsed with noise, the clamor of coins, the braying of animals, the hum of bargaining voices. Wooden platforms lined the center, each one occupied by women bound in silk too bright for their suffering. Their wrists were tied, their faces powdered to hide exhaustion, their bodies forced into poses of submission. Men circled them like wolves, their eyes hungry, their hands prodding, their mouths spitting judgments. Too thin, good hips. Strong arms, she'll work hard. Each comment struck Amara harder than any whip. These were not women anymore in the eyes of the crowd. They were livestock with price tags, bow forced. Amara and the others onto one of the platforms. She felt dozens of eyes crawl over her, peeling her dignity away layer by layer. A merchant tugged at her arm, another tilted her chin upward, another tapped her teeth to check their strength. She kept her face blank, her gaze fixed on some distant horizon. Inside, her soul raged. Master Wei stood nearby, his expression calm, almost proud. He did not shout like the other men, did not bargain loudly. He let them come to him, whispering in low tones, his hand resting on the ledger of names and numbers. Amara understood then. She was both possession and profit. Wei would sell some, trade others, buy new ones. Each body was a coin, each scar a deduction in value. She remembered her mother's face. The stories of ancestors who once walked freely under the African sun. What would they say if they saw her now, priced and measured like a goat? Her chest burned with shame and fury. Asterisk, the market went on for hours. One by one, girls were taken away. Some wept, begging not to be separated from their friends. Others went silent, their faces pale masks. The men who purchased them laughed, spoke of weddings and work, of bloodlines and bargains. Amara watched Melon dragged off the platform by a fat merchant with gold rings on every finger. Melon's eyes locked with hers for a heartbeat wide. Pleading, terrified, before she disappeared into the crowd, Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to scream her name, to fight, to tear the merchant apart with her bare hands. But Bao's whip coiled in the corner of her eye, ready to strike so. She stood, trembling, her hands clenched into fists behind her back. When it was her turn, Wei did not offer her for sale. Men asked. They offered bags of coins, bolts of silk, even horses. Wei only smiled. This one is not for sale. The men frowned, muttered, moved on. Amara could not decide whether to feel relief or despair. She would not be taken away, but she would remain his, bound to the quiet cruelty of the man who had stolen her name. Her freedom, her very worth. That night, back in her cell, she wept for Malin, for the others who had vanished. She pressed her palms against the dirt floor,
Eyes.
whispering their names into the earth, as if the soil could carry their memory. She whispered her own name too, Amara. Because if she stopped saying it, if she let the world erase it, then she would be nothing but a number in Wei's ledger. The bride market carved something new into her. Not only pain, not only humiliation, but clarity. She saw now the machinery of it all. Women stolen, beaten, polished into dolls, sold to men who saw them as tools, slaves, wives, in name but property in truth. It was a cycle that stretched across borders, across villages, across seas. She was a single thread in a vast, dark tapestry, but even a single thread could fray, could tear, could unravel the fabric if pulled hard enough. As Amara lay in the darkness, her body trembling with exhaustion, she swore she would one day pull, even if it cost her life. Asterisk chains can break bone, tear skin, crush spirit, but sometimes chains awaken fire. The days after the bride market were heavy with silence. The compound felt emptier, the absence of the women who had been sold, leaving behind a suffocating void. Amara moved through her labor with a weight in her chest. Each missing voice was another wound. She remembered Milan's eyes as they were pulled apart, desperate, pleading, resigned. The memory followed her everywhere, clinging to her like shadow. Bo seemed restless too. With fewer women, his rage burned hotter. His whip struck more often, his commands harsher. He seemed to take cruel pleasure in filling the silence with screams. One morning, when Amara stumbled while carrying buckets of water, Bo struck her so hard across the face that her vision flashed white. She dropped to her knees, tasting blood. "Get up," he snarled. "You're not here to crawl." Her body obeyed. But inside something shifted. A seed of anger, buried deep, sprouted into flame. Master Wei noticed. He studied her during evening inspections, his calm eyes lingering. "You burn differently now," he remarked one night, almost curious. "Do you think fire will save you?" Amara lowered her gaze but did not answer. Wei chuckled. "Fire consumes. You'll burn yourself." "Before you burn me," his words cut deep, yet they could not smother what had ignited in her. If she was to burn, then she would burn brightly, fiercely enough to leave a mark. Even if her ashes were scattered, the cruelty escalated. Bao devised new punishments, forcing Amara to kneel on gravel until her knees bled, binding her wrists. 2 heavy stones and making her walk the courtyard, plunging her into freezing water and holding her there until her lungs screamed for air. Each punishment carved deeper into her body. But instead of breaking, she began to endure. She learned how to control her breath, how to lock her mind away from pain. She closed her eyes and pictured the African sun warming her skin. Her mother's voice singing lullabies, her brother's laughter ringing like bells. Every lash, every strike, every humiliation became another lesson in endurance. Pain no longer ruled her, she ruled it. One night, after a particularly brutal punishment, Amara collapsed in her cell. Her body shivered, feverish, but her spirit refused to surrender. Another slave, Hannah, an older woman with hollow eyes, whispered, "Why do you still fight inside?" "Most of us, we are already dead." Amara turned her head, her lips cracked, but firm, "because if I stop fighting, then I am not alive." "I will not give him that." Hannah stared at her for a long time. Then, for the first time in years, Hannah's lips curved into the faintest, trembling smile. "You remind me of who I once was," she whispered. Word spread quietly among the women. Amara's defiance, silent, hidden, but undeniable, became a spark for others. They began to whisper their real names to each other at night, refusing to let them be erased. They shared fragments of songs, tiny prayers, stories of home. It was dangerous, foolish even, but it gave them something Wei could not own. Memory Bao sensed the shift, though he could not trace its source. His punishments grew harsher, more frequent. He wanted to crush the ember he sensed glowing in the shadows, but the more he tried, the more it burned. One evening, Wei gathered the slaves in the courtyard. His voice was calm, his demeanor regal, but his eyes were sharp. Disobedience, he said, is a disease, and disease must be burned out before it spreads. He gestured toward a pile of wooden stakes. Torches flickered in the night air. Amara's stomach tightened. She understood. That night, one of the men was bound to the stakes for attempting escape. His screams filled the compound as fire devoured him. The women were forced to watch, their faces twisted in horror, their tears streaming silently. Wei spoke over the flames. "This is what fire brings. Not freedom, only ashes." Amara trembled as the smoke choked her lungs, but in her heart she whispered, "Ashes can feed the soil." From ashes, seeds grow. Wei saw only destruction and fire. Amara saw rebirth. When she returned to her cell, her body still shaking, she pressed her palms into the earth. "I am not ash yet," she whispered. "I am flame." The chains around her wrists burned her skin raw. But now, when she looked at them, she did not see only prison. She saw proof that she was still alive, still fighting, still burning, and she swore, when the time came, she would use her fire to break the chains, hers, and perhaps others too, even if it meant setting the whole world ablaze. Asterisk every rebellion begins not with swords or fire, but with whispers in the dark. Amara's body was scarred, but her spirit refused to wither. The flames of punishment still burned in her memory, yet instead of fear, they left her sharpened. Wei and Bo believed they had taught her the language of submission. In truth, they had given her a new tongue, the language of defiance spoken, in silence, in glances, in whispers, at night. When the compound sank into shadows and the guards grew weary, Amara began to whisper. Her voice, hoarse from years of screaming into the void, became soft as a thread. To Hannah she whispered her brother's name. To another woman, she whispered the story of her mother's lullaby. To a young girl trembling in chains, she whispered, "You are still human." The words spread like hidden embers, passed from lip to lip, tiny sparks glowing in the darkness. The first act of defiance was simple. They began to say their names aloud, not the names Wei recorded in his ledgers. Not the names overseers barked at them, but their true names, the ones carried from their mothers, their ancestors, their homes. One by one, in the stillness of night, the women spoke them. Some cried when the syllables rolled off their tongues, unfamiliar after years of silence. Others trembled, as if afraid that speaking their name might. Summon the whip. Amara said hers with steady breath. Amara. And when she did, the others repeated it softly, reverently. As if weaving it into the fabric of their shared memory, names became prayers. Soon whispers turned to acts. One evening, a guard left a loaf of bread carelessly close to the cells. Instead of fighting over it, Amara broke it into pieces and shared it equally. The others watched in awe. For years, survival had been individual, selfish. Each woman forced to claw for scraps, but that night hunger was lessened by unity. Another time, when Bo struck a young girl until she collapsed. Amara knelt beside her after he left, binding her wounds with strips torn from her own robe. "He wants us broken," Amara whispered, "but broken things can still cut." The girl's eyes lit with fragile hope. Asterisk Bao began to sense the shift. He saw how the women glanced at each other when his back was turned, how silence fell heavy when he entered, how they seemed less cowed, less solitary. Rage twisted his features. One morning, he dragged Amara into the courtyard before everyone. "You are the disease," he spat. "You spread poison among them." His whip slashed her back, each strike tearing skin. Each strike meant to break not only her, but the will of all who watched. But Amara did not cry out. She clenched her teeth, blood running down her spine, and forced her body to remain standing. Her silence was louder than screams, her endurance a defiance that burned hotter than fire. When Bo paused, panting with effort, the courtyard was deathly silent. Then, softly, a voice rose from the line of women. Amara Bao froze. Another voice echoed it. Amara. Then another. Soon the air trembled with dozens of voices, whispering her name like a chant, like a hymn. Like the sound of chains rattling before they break. Bo's whip fell from his hand. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. That night Wei summoned Amara to his chamber. "You think yourself a leader now," he said, pouring tea with deliberate calm. "You think whispers will topple me? Foolish girl." Amara knelt, her head bowed, but her silence was no longer submission, was shield, resistance, quiet refusal. Wei leaned closer, his voice a serpent's hiss. "Remember this. Whispers can be silenced. Leaders can be broken. Fire can be smothered." Amara lifted her gaze just enough to meet his eyes. And though her lips did not part, her stare said what her words could not. "You cannot kill what you cannot own." Wei's hand trembled. Slightly as he set down his cup. The rebellion had not yet begun. Not in chains shattered or walls burned, but it had begun in whispers, in names spoken, in bread shared, in wounds bound. in voices chanting against the lash, and though no one outside the compound knew it yet, a storm was gathering, a storm born of women who remembered who they were. A storm carried in the whispers of the enslaved. Asterisk hope is dangerous. For those in chains, it is salvation. For those who hold the chains, it is threat. The morning after the whispers filled the courtyard, the atmosphere shifted. Guards prowled with sharper eyes, their grips on spears tighter. Bo's whip never left his hand. The air itself seemed tense, as though waiting for thunder to strike. Amara sensed it. The rebellion had not gone unnoticed. She tried to warn the others, "Stay silent, don't let them see." But the seed was already planted, and seeds cannot be unplanted. That evening, the storm broke. Bo entered the women's quarters with a squad of guards. His eyes gleamed with cruelty, his voice a blade. "Bring her out," he barked. Hands seized Amara, dragging her into the courtyard. The others followed, herded into a circle. A stake had been driven into the earth, ropes coiled beside it. Wei stood at the center, his robe pristine, his face calm. "You think yourselves strong," he said, his voice carrying over the silent courtyard. "You think whispers make you free. Let me remind you what freedom costs." Amara was bound to the stake. The ropes cut deep into her wrists, splinters piercing her skin. Bo's whip uncoiled, the leather glistening in the torchlight. The punishment was not for a single mistake. It was for defiance itself. Each lash fell with merciless precision. The crack of leather echoed like thunder. Blood stained her robe. Her breath broke into ragged gasps. Her body threatened to collapse, yet she did not scream. Her silence was heavier than sound. Wei's gaze never left her. He wanted to see her break, to watch the fire in her eyes extinguish. But even as pain tore through her, Amara forced herself to stand in the ropes, forced her head not to bow. Her body bent, but her spirit would not. The women wept as they watched. Some turned away, unable to bear it. Others clenched their fists, rage boiling in their chests. And then, softly, like a trembling bird, a voice spoke. "Amara." Wei's head snapped toward the crowd. Another voice joined. "Amara." The chant rose again, fragile but defiant, echoing the night when they first spoke her name. Bao roared with fury, striking harder, but the voices only grew. "Amara, Amara, Amara." The courtyard trembled with it. Not rebellion yet, but something more dangerous. Solidarity. Wei raised his hand. And silence fell. "Enough," he commanded. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "If they worship fire, then let them see what fire does." He nodded to Bao. Bao dragged another woman forward. Hannah. The older woman gasped, struggling weakly as ropes bound her hands. Her eyes found Amara's wide with fear. "No," Amara rasped, her throat raw. "Not her or me." But Wei only smiled. "You think yourself leader? Then you will learn the price of leadership." Hannah was tied to the second stake. Torches flickered dangerously close. The women screamed, begged, fell to their knees. Act. But Wei's face remained stone. "This is your rebellion's reward," he said coldly. At the last moment, Amara's voice rang out, hoarse but strong. "Look at me. It is me you want." Wei studied her. For the first time, something like hesitation crossed his face. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps calculation. Slowly, he lowered his hand. Hannah was spared. For now, but Amara paid. Bo whipped her until her body collapsed, until her blood painted the stake, until her vision blurred into darkness. She felt herself slipping, drifting into the abyss. Yet even as she fell, she heard the voices. "Amara, Amara." Her name carried by dozens of lips, carried like a prayer, like a promise. And in that moment she understood. She was no longer just. Herself, she was symbol. Symbols could not be killed. They left her half dead in the dirt. Guards assumed she would not last the night, but in the quiet hours, the women gathered around her. They cleaned her wounds with stolen water, pressed their hands to her skin, whispered her name like a spell. Hannah wept as she held Amara's hand. "You gave yourself for me?" "Why?" Amara's lips cracked into a faint, bloody smile. "Because if one of us survives, then all of us can." The women bowed their heads, their tears soaking the earth. The price of defiance had been steep, but it had also forged something unbreakable: unity. Chains could bind bodies, whips could scar flesh, but solidarity made them dangerous. And Amara, though broken, burned brighter than ever. Asterisk, every story ends in fire. Some burn to ash, some burn to light the dawn. Amara's body was broken, but her spirit refused to die. Days blurred into nights, fever racking her limbs, blood seeping from half-healed wounds. The overseers assumed she was too far gone to matter, but the women nursed her in secret, pressing cool cloths to her burns, slipping crumbs of food past the guards, whispering strength into her ears. "You are flame," Hannah murmured. "You are hope," said the young girl whose tears Amara once dried. Amara listened, her body trembling, her eyes half shut. She wanted to believe them. She wanted to believe she could still rise. And deep inside, the embers still glowed. One night, Wei summoned her again. Dragged before him, she could barely stand. Yet she forced her back straight. Her gaze leveled Wei, studied her with cold fascination. "You should be dead," he said softly. "But you cling to life like a weed between stones. Tell me why." Amara's voice was a whisper, but steady. "'Cause you cannot kill fire." Wei's lips curved into a thin smile. "Then I will show you how fire ends." He ordered Bo to prepare the stakes again. This time, not for punishment, for execution. The courtyard filled, torches blazed, chains rattled. The air was thick with dread. Amara was bound once more, the ropes biting into her torn skin. Beside her, another woman sobbed, a young bride freshly taken from the market. Trembling with terror, Wei's voice rose, calm and cruel. "This is the fate of those who defy. Let their screams teach you obedience." The torch was raised, but before the flame could touch, a sound broke the silence. A whisper, "Amara." Then another Amara. The chant grew louder, stronger, until the courtyard shook with it. The women stamped their feet, clanged their chains, shouted her name like thunder. "Amara, Amara, Amara." For the first time, Wei's mask cracked. Rage twisted his face. "Silence them," he roared. Guards rushed forward, but the women did not stop. They pulled against their chains, spat in the faces of soldiers, raised their voices. Higher. The courtyard erupted, not yet freedom, but resistance made flesh. Amara lifted her head, her voice breaking but fierce. "Am Amara?" Her cry pierced the night, carried on the storm of voices. What happened next would be remembered in fragments, in whispers carried far beyond the compound. Some said the women surged together, overwhelming a guard, seizing a torch. Others said Bo, shaken by fear, stumbled, and the flames consumed him instead. Some swore that Wei himself fled into the dark, his empire of chains cracking beneath the weight of defiance. But all agreed on one truth. That night, the compound burned, whether by chance or destiny. Fire swept through the courtyard, devouring the stakes, the ropes, the walls. Smoke rose into the sky like a beacon. Amara's body was swallowed by the chaos. Some said she perished in the flames, her spirit soaring free at last. Others believed she escaped, carried away in the confusion, vanishing into the forests, a ghost of resistance who would one day return. But to the women who survived, the answer mattered less than what she left behind: her name, her fire, her unbroken defiance. In the months that followed, whispers of the burning spread across villages, across provinces, across borders. Slaves in other compounds murmured her name in the night. Amara. It became not just a name, but a symbol of endurance, of unity, of a flame that could not be smothered. And though her body was bound, beaten, scarred, perhaps even consumed by. Fire, Amara had become what Wei feared most, unforgettable. Every story ends in fire. Hers did not end in ashes. It burned into dawn.